4:11 a.m. Tuesday. Benson neighborhood. Omaha, Nebraska. 11 agents from the FBI's hostage rescue team moved single file along the east wall of a duplex on a residential block where the streetlights had been dark for 2 weeks. The lawn was cut. The mailbox was full. A plastic wreath hung on the front door. From the outside, it looked like nobody was home. From the inside, 20 young women were waiting, though most of them had stopped counting days. The first agent reached the door. He raised his hand, held it. 4 seconds of silence. Then the signal dropped. The breach took 11 seconds. Flash, clear, stairs. The HRT team found the basement partition before they found the stairs to it, a sheet of plywood framed inside a doorway that wasn't on any blueprint the Bureau had pulled from city records. Behind it, a corridor. Behind that, a room. What agents found in that room created 47 pages of federal documentation, 2 supplemental indictments, and a clinical intake summary from the Nebraska Medical Center that used only 3 words to describe the condition of the women inside. Prolonged. Confinement. Consistent. The nurses at NMC knew better than to write more than they could clinically support. Federal prosecutors would later say the same thing about the case file. The horror wasn't in what was written. It was in what the paperwork refused to say out loud. This is the story of how a single line in a sentencing exhibit, a utility account that should have been closed, led federal agents to that basement, to those 20 women, and to a network that prosecutors had believed they'd already dismantled. They hadn't. The case started not with a raid, not with a tip, and not with surveillance footage. It started with a paralegal named Rachel Voss sitting at a workstation on the 4th floor of the federal building on Farnham Street in downtown Omaha, reviewing sentencing exhibits for 2 men who were already in custody. The date was March 17, 2026. A Monday. Voss had been with the U.S. Attorney's Office for 4 years. Her job on this particular afternoon was to verify that all attached exhibits in the sentencing package for defendants Marcus Del Rey Hodge and Leon Terrence Pruitt had been properly indexed and cross-referenced. Hodge had pleaded guilty in January. Pruitt in February. Both were scheduled for sentencing the following month. The case was, by every institutional measure, closed. Voss worked through the exhibit list methodically. Lease agreements, bank statements, phone records, vehicle registrations. Then she reached Exhibit 41, a compilation of utility account records attached to 3 rental properties the defendants had used as operational addresses. The accounts had been subpoenaed, reviewed, and entered into the record by an FBI analyst the previous October. 2 of the accounts had been closed when the properties were vacated. Standard. Expected. The 3rd had not. The account was registered to a name Voss didn't recognize from any other exhibit in the file. The property address was on a residential block in the Benson neighborhood, north of Dodge Street, west of 52nd. A duplex. The account had been opened in November of 2025, 3 months after the 2 defendants had been arrested. It was still drawing power. Voss flagged it with a single line in a case memo. She described it the way she described everything: flat, institutional, no adjectives. Utility account, Exhibit 41, Property 3, remains active as of March 17, 2026. Account holder does not appear in any exhibit, indictment, or supplemental filing. Recommend review. She forwarded the memo to the supervising OSA at 3:42 in the afternoon. Then she went back to indexing. What she didn't know, and wouldn't know until the news cycle caught up with the raid 6 weeks later, was that her memo had just reopened a federal investigation that 2 senior prosecutors believed was finished. The Omaha field office of the FBI received the referral from the OSA's office on March 19th. It landed on the desk of Special Agent Daniel Marwick, a 12-year Bureau veteran who had worked the original Hodge-Pruitt case from its early stages, before being reassigned to a separate financial crimes matter in January. Marwick read Voss's memo. "Read it again." Then he pulled the original case file, all 612 pages of it. The investigation into Hodge-Pruitt had begun the previous autumn, in October of 2025, after an anonymous tip to the FBI's online tip portal described a van making late-night visits to a property in northwest Omaha. The tip was vague. The details were thin. But a field supervisor had authorized a preliminary license plate reader pull on the block, and what came back was worth pursuing. The same panel van appearing at the same address on 17 separate occasions across a 30-day window, always between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., always departing before sunrise. The van was registered to a shell company. The shell company listed a mail drop in Council Bluffs, Iowa as its registered address. The mail drop was leased under a name that matched no social security number in federal databases. Marwick had worked that thread for 6 weeks before it led anywhere solid. The break came when a postal inspector flagged a second address associated with the same false name, a storage unit in Bellevue. Inside, prepaid phones, wire transfer receipts, and a handwritten ledger that used numeric codes for locations and initials for people. From there, the case built quickly. Hodge-Pruitt were identified through cell tower data. Surveillance confirmed their movements. A cooperating witness provided enough corroboration for arrest warrants. Both men were taken into custody in late November 2025, within 6 hours of each other. At the time of their arrest, federal agents had searched and vacated 3 properties connected to the operation. They believed those 3 properties were the full operational footprint. They were wrong. There were 4 properties. One detail that kept nagging me as I read through the case documentation: the original tip to the FBI's portal had mentioned a van. Singular. But the plate reader logs pulled during the subsequent investigation showed not 1 van, but 3, rotating between what turned out to be 4 locations on an irregular schedule, clearly designed to avoid pattern detection. 3 of those 4 locations were identified during the investigation. The 4th, the Benson duplex, was never in the original case's geographic scope. It appeared nowhere in the original warrant applications, which meant when agents arrested Hodge-Pruitt and searched 3 properties, they closed the file on a network that had a 4th address they'd never walked into. The utility account was the ghost. Marwick requested a records pull on the Benson duplex the morning of March 20th. What came back told its own story before any surveillance was deployed. The account had been opened November 14, 2025, 2 weeks after Hodge-Pruitt were arrested. Whoever had opened it had done so knowing the 2 named defendants were in custody. Whoever had opened it had kept the operation running. Electricity consumption at the duplex for the 4-month period between November and March averaged 340 kilowatt-hours per month. For a single empty duplex in a Nebraska winter, the typical baseline would be 90 to 110 kilowatt-hours. Vacant properties draw almost nothing. Minimal HVAC to prevent pipe damage. Maybe a single circuit. 340 kilowatt-hours. That number meant people. Multiple people. Heat, light, cooking, appliances. And whoever they were being kept inside because there had been no visual activity at the property in 4 months of neighborhood records. No cars in the driveway. No residents coming or going. The lawn service that maintained the property was contracted through a company that took cash and asked no questions. The mailbox collected grocery flyers and pizza coupons addressed to current resident. Marwick brought the electricity figures to his field supervisor. "Empty houses don't use that kind of power," he said. 2 hours later, the Omaha field office had an emergency warrant application in front of a federal magistrate. The surveillance operation that followed was quick and tight. The Bureau had learned from the original Hodge-Pruitt investigation that extended foot surveillance in residential neighborhoods drew attention. They didn't need weeks. They needed to confirm what the utility data was already telling them. They deployed covert plate reader units on 3 blocks surrounding the Benson duplex. Mobile units rotated through the area on civilian vehicle schedules. Nothing tactical, nothing that would flag to anyone watching the street. The units looked like contractor vans and rideshare vehicles. They changed positions every 40 minutes. The agents inside wore civilian clothes and kept the windows up. Within 48 hours, the plate readers had confirmed 3 separate vehicles making irregular visits to the duplex. 2 of the vehicles came back clean. The third, a white panel van with a commercial cleaning company decal, came back registered to a company that did not appear in Nebraska's Secretary of State Business Registry. Same pattern as the original case. New company name. New address. Same method. The van had appeared at the duplex on 7 occasions in the previous 30 days, always arriving after 9 p.m. and departing within 90 minutes. Cargo in, nothing visible out. Whatever was being brought into that duplex was staying inside. Marwick's team pulled the driver's image from a plate reader camera on the block to the east. The image was partial, a side profile, commercial-grade resolution. The camera had captured the moment the driver slowed for a stop sign at the corner of 51st and Maple, his face turned slightly toward the lens the way drivers unconsciously check cross-traffic. The exposure lasted less than a second. It was enough. The facial geometry matched. At 73% confidence, a third individual who had appeared in the background of a surveillance photo from the original Hodge-Pruitt investigation. A man who had never been charged, never been interviewed, whose name appeared nowhere in the original case documentation except as an unidentified figure standing near a vehicle in a parking lot image. He had a name now. The Bureau ran him through 6 databases over 12 hours. He was not in the country legally. He had entered through a port of entry in Texas in August of 2025 on a visitor visa that had expired 90 days later. There was no departure record. He had vanished into the interior of the country in November, which was, to the week, when the Benson utility account had been opened. The operation hadn't collapsed when Hodge and Pruitt were arrested. It had transferred. Whoever this third individual was, he hadn't panicked. He had reorganized, found a new location, and kept running. The 2 prosecuted defendants weren't the top of this structure. They were middle management. Marwick flagged the discovery upstairs. The Omaha field office elevated the case to a joint operation with the FBI's Innocence Lost National Initiative Task Force, which coordinated with the U.S. Marshals and the Department of Homeland Security. The operational command moved from the field office level to a multi-agency coordination cell. The target inside the Benson duplex was no longer just a building. It was a live, active operation run by a man federal agents had walked past in a photograph and never looked at twice. Here is what strikes us about this case. The original investigation was competently run. The agents who built the Hodge-Pruitt case worked with what they had and secured 2 convictions. The failure wasn't investigative negligence. It was a scope problem. The original case was defined by what it found, not by what it might have missed. A paralegal doing routine exhibit indexing saw the gap that 4 months of active investigation had not. That isn't an indictment of the agents. It's an argument for the paperwork. The bureaucratic machinery of federal prosecution, the exhibit lists, the utility records, the filed and cross-referenced documentation, caught what the investigation didn't. Sometimes the file knows more than the field office. Before the operational plan for the raid was finalized, Marwick's team spent 3 days attempting to build a fuller picture of who exactly was inside the Benson duplex and in what condition. This required a level of careful intelligence work that could not rely on direct observation. Any foot traffic near the property risked exposure. Any vehicle that paused too long on the block risked being noticed by whoever was monitoring the street from inside. The team used what they had: thermal imaging, conducted from a vehicle parked briefly at the curb under the cover of a utility company work order, showed concentrated heat signatures in the basement level of the duplex during the overnight hours of March 23rd. The imaging was conducted at 2:15 in the morning, when ambient temperature was 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the contrast between interior and exterior heat was at its sharpest. The signature showed multiple distinct heat sources in a space smaller than the main floor footprint. The analyst who processed the imaging estimated, conservatively, between 15 and 25 individuals in a confined basement area. Marwick sat with that number for a long time before he wrote it into the operational briefing. The team also obtained, through a subpoena served to a regional food distribution company, records showing that the Benson address had been associated with 3 separate grocery delivery orders in the preceding 6 weeks. The orders had been placed online under a false name and paid with a prepaid debit card that traced back to a convenience store in Sioux Falls. Each order contained large quantities of shelf-stable food, dried beans, rice, canned goods, cooking oil, and had been delivered during daytime hours when neighbors were least likely to be watching from windows. The delivery records listed a signature. The signature was illegible. The delivery driver, reached by phone, remembered the orders because of their size and because the man who answered the door had been polite, paid in cash for any extras, and had never invited him past the threshold. That detail, the door never fully opening, no glimpse of the interior, a transaction completed on the porch, was consistent with careful operational security. Whoever was managing the Benson property had thought through every point of external contact and minimized each one. What Marwick's team was building, piece by piece, was a portrait of people who were very good at not being seen. The food orders, the nighttime van visits, the cash lawn service, the utility account in a name that matched no database. Every element of the property's external life had been engineered to read as ordinary vacancy. The thermal imaging said otherwise. The kilowatt hours said otherwise. And somewhere in that basement, behind a plywood partition nobody had yet looked behind, the reality of what was happening said otherwise, in a way that no utility record or food delivery log could fully capture. The operational plan for the Benson raid was developed over 10 days. The primary concern was the structure of the duplex itself. City records showed the building as a standard 2-unit residential property, built in 1962, with a basement unit listed as unfinished storage. What agents needed to know was whether the basement had been modified, and, if so, how extensively. They got their answer through a detail that had nothing to do with surveillance. A natural gas line service call had been logged at the Benson address in January of 2026. A technician from the utility company had visited to check a pressure irregularity on the block's distribution line. Standard maintenance. He had checked the exterior junction and noted in his log that he had not been permitted access to the interior of the property when he knocked. The resident who answered the door, described in his log only as a male, 40s, did not provide a name, had told him the interior lines were not connected to the service. The technician had noted the exterior lines showed normal pressure and closed the service call without further action. What he had not noted, but what Marwick extracted from his memory during a follow-up interview 3 weeks later, was that when the door opened, briefly, he had heard something he'd attributed at the time to a television or radio. A low, sustained background noise. When Marwick pressed him on it, the technician described it more precisely. It sounded like people, he said. Like a lot of people in a small space. Marwick passed this to the HRT coordinator. The plywood partition in the basement, the one that would later appear in the federal documentation, was anticipated in the tactical planning before the agents ever breached the door. The FBI's hostage rescue team deployed from Quantico on a tactical air movement that arrived at Offutt Air Force Base at 11:40 p.m. on the Monday before the raid. They staged at a secure facility and reviewed blueprints, thermal imaging data, and the plate reader history of the block. The building's entry points had been cataloged: front door, rear kitchen door, 2 basement egress windows on the north side, and a bulkhead access door on the east elevation that the original city blueprints showed as a coal chute conversion. The HRT coordinator assigned coverage to all 4 secondary points before designating the front door as the primary breach location. The lock mechanism, visible through a telephoto lens during a slow drive-by conducted at dusk on the Sunday before the raid, was a standard deadbolt with no visible secondary reinforcement. The door frame was original construction, 62-year-old wood that would not hold against a ram. The third individual, the unidentified man from the original surveillance photograph, was expected to be inside. A federal arrest warrant for unlawful re-entry and a material witness warrant for criminal enterprise had been approved the previous Friday. But here is where the operation nearly fell apart before it started. At 11 minutes past 2 in the morning, the surveillance unit monitoring the duplex from a parked vehicle 2 blocks north reported unexpected movement. The panel van, the white commercial van that had served as the primary delivery vehicle, was pulling out of the alley behind the property. At 2 in the morning, unscheduled. The HRT coordinator had 2 options. Hold the raid timeline and let the van go, which risked alerting the occupants if the driver reached a point where he could communicate. Or accelerate, breaching immediately while the van was still in proximity and before the driver could establish distance. The problem with acceleration, the entry team was not yet in final position. 2 agents were still moving up the east wall when the van pulled out. The coordinator made the call in 40 seconds. Hold. Let the van move. Maintain surveillance on the van with a mobile unit. Do not breach until the entry team is confirmed in position and the van is far enough removed that interception won't compromise the primary objective. The mobile surveillance unit followed the van 6 blocks north, where it pulled into a 24-hour gas station. The driver went inside. The mobile unit held. Back at the duplex, the entry team completed its final movement at 3:59 a.m. The 2 agents who had held their position along the east wall during the van's departure had been motionless in sub-freezing temperature for nearly 2 hours. Neither moved to adjust their position. Neither made a sound. The radio discipline during that hold was total, no transmissions except the periodic 10-second status clicks that confirmed each unit was in position and had not been compromised. The coordinator, listening from a vehicle 4 blocks away, counted those clicks the way a surgeon counts instruments. The coordinator gave the go signal at 4:11. The breach took 11 seconds. The first flashbang went into the main floor. 2 agents held the front room while 6 moved down the stairs. The plywood partition was exactly where the tactical plan had placed it, on the north wall of the basement, framed with lumber screws. 1 agent used a pry bar. The partition came away from the frame in 2 sections. Behind it, a corridor approximately 8 feet long, widening into a room with low ceilings and 2 hanging fluorescent fixtures. The room was warm. The ventilation was mechanical. A residential HVAC unit had been routed through the exterior wall with flexible ductwork. Whoever had built this had anticipated long-term occupation of the space. 20 adults, ages 22 to 26, all American citizens, reported missing from towns between Lincoln, Nebraska and Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Each one with a family that Federal Victim Services coordinators would be calling before 6 a.m. The adults were moved upstairs in groups of 4. Paramedics had staged on the curb 2 blocks east and were on scene within 4 minutes of the all clear. The medical triage at the scene was efficient and quiet. Blood pressure, hydration status, neurological baseline. Clinical. The nurses from Nebraska Medical Center who met the ambulances at the emergency bay would later document their findings in the 3-word phrase that became the only public-facing description of their condition. Prolonged. Confinement. Consistent. 1 intake note from that morning, prepared by the head trauma nurse on the overnight shift, mentioned dehydration and documented a range of physical indicators consistent with extended confinement in a restricted space. The note was 4 paragraphs long. Federal prosecutors filed it as an exhibit. The defense did not contest it. At the gas station 6 blocks north, the mobile surveillance unit watched the driver of the panel van exit the building with a paper coffee cup and walk back toward the van. He had his phone out. He was looking at the screen. At 4:21 a.m., 10 minutes after the breach, he stopped walking. He stood in the parking lot for 8 seconds, staring at the phone. Then he walked to the van, got in, and started the engine. He made it 4 blocks before 2 unmarked federal vehicles box-blocked the intersection at 49th and Maple. 3 agents on foot reached his door before he had processed what was happening. He was in federal custody at 4:27 a.m. His name, as confirmed through biometric processing at the field office later that morning, matched the identity of a foreign national with an expired visa whose legal name appeared in no prior federal charging document. He was processed under a federal criminal complaint filed before noon. The charges included conspiracy, unlawful re-entry, and federal counts arising from the operation of the Benson property. He sat across from 2 federal agents for 3 hours and said nothing except to ask for water. He got the water. He didn't get a deal. What followed the arrest, the processing, the fingerprinting, the document photography, the booking chain, was standard federal intake procedure. What was not standard was what the evidence response team found when they processed the panel van at the FBI's secure vehicle processing bay later that morning. The cleaning company decal on the side panel had been applied over an older decal, incompletely removed. Beneath the commercial cleaning logo, technicians found remnants of a second company name, a landscaping business registered in Missouri, associated through a corporate filing trace with the same Delaware management entity that owned the Benson duplex. The layer beneath the layer. The name beneath the name. It was the kind of detail that meant nothing by itself, and everything in context. The forensic accountants would work that thread for weeks. The interrogation of the third defendant began at 8:42 that morning, after he had been medically cleared, read his rights, and provided with water and a meal. The interview was conducted by Marwick and a second agent from the Innocence Lost Task Force, a woman named Special Agent Corinne Ibarra, who had worked trafficking investigations for 9 years across 3 field offices. Ibarra had a reputation in the task force for patience. She did not raise her voice. She did not make promises she couldn't keep. She had learned, over 9 years, that the silence of a subject who is deciding whether to talk is a different kind of silence than the silence of a subject who has decided not to. She could feel the difference. This subject had decided not to. He answered basic biographical questions in English that was careful and deliberate. He confirmed his name. He confirmed he understood the charges. He confirmed he understood his right to counsel. Then he stopped confirming anything. The agents laid photographs on the table. Images from inside the duplex, taken by the evidence response team after the victims had been transported. The room behind the partition. The HVAC ductwork. The fluorescent fixtures. The food stores. The mattresses laid out in rows. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the table. He looked at the wall. Ibarra let the silence hold for 4 minutes before she spoke. "There are 5 location codes in that ledger we don't have addresses for," she said. "You help us find those addresses before someone else gets hurt. That's a conversation. You don't help us. The ledger still gets worked, and you're just one of the people we process on the way to figuring it out." He asked for water. She got him the water. He said nothing else that was useful. The interview was suspended at 11:55. His court-appointed attorney arrived at 12:30. The federal complaint was filed at 1:15 p.m. He was transported to the Sarpy County Federal Holding Facility before nightfall. Ibarra wrote her interview summary in the car on the way back to the field office. It was 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph contained a single sentence that she would later describe, in a conversation with the task force coordinator, as the most important thing she'd written all year. Subject demonstrated awareness of the ledger's contents and did not dispute its relevance, which suggests the coding system is accurate and the unmatched location codes represent active or recently active sites. That sentence was in the operational briefing distributed to the Innocence Loss Task Force by the end of the week. Consider this. Did the system fail these 20 adults the moment it closed the original case file? Or was that failure unavoidable, given what investigators actually knew at the time? There's a strong case either way, and it's not straightforward to blame the Bureau. The prosecution that followed the Benson raid moved fast by federal standards. The U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Nebraska filed a superseding indictment in the Hodge-Pruitt matter on April 4, 2026, adding the third defendant and expanding the count structure to reflect the full operational scope the Benson evidence had revealed. The original two defendants, already sentenced, had their cases referred for potential sentence modification proceedings based on the new material. Federal law allows for this when new evidence materially changes the factual record. Hodge and Pruitt had each received sentences in the range that the original plea agreements and offense calculations supported. The superseding indictment's new factual findings, specifically the evidence that the operation had continued in an active form after their arrest, at a property directly linked to the same criminal enterprise, created the legal basis for a review. Whether that review would result in modified sentences was, as of early July of 2026, still pending before the court. The third defendant was held without bail. The federal magistrate cited flight risk and the absence of any verifiable community ties in the United States. His visa had expired in the autumn. He had no legal status. He had, according to the federal complaint, continued operating a criminal enterprise on American soil for 4 months after the two men above him in the structure had been arrested. The network, in its operational form, was now dismantled. The Benson duplex was sealed as a federal crime scene and subsequently condemned by the City of Omaha's Building Authority, which found the plywood partition and the rerouted HVAC to constitute unpermitted structural modifications in violation of Municipal Housing Code. The property's listed owner, a management company registered in Delaware, had not responded to city inquiries as of the date of this account. Federal investigators were pursuing the corporate structure through financial subpoenas. Whether that corporate trail would lead to additional defendants was an open question that the U.S. Attorney's Office declined to comment on publicly. One detail that stuck with me throughout this case: the management company that owned the Benson duplex had also owned, through a different subsidiary name, one of the 3 properties that Hodge and Pruitt had used in the original operation. This had appeared in the original case documentation. It had been noted. It had not been pursued, because at the time, both properties had been vacated and the corporate connection appeared, on the surface, like ordinary landlord overlap. In hindsight, it was the thread that, if pulled earlier, might have found the Benson address before March. Before winter, before 4 months had passed, that thread was now being pulled by a team of forensic accountants in the U.S. Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit who were working through the Delaware subsidiary's filing history with methodical patience. The forensic accountants had pulled the Delaware entity's full filing history going back to its incorporation in 2019. 7 years of annual reports, registered agent changes, and subsidiary registrations across 4 states. The entity had, over that period, acquired and disposed of 17 properties in the Midwest through a chain of subsidiary LLCs, each registered in a different state, and each using a different registered agent. The pattern was deliberate, layering corporate distance between the operating entity and any single transaction that might draw scrutiny. To a county assessor reviewing property transfers, each sale looked like ordinary real estate activity. To a forensic accountant looking at all 17 transactions simultaneously and mapping the beneficial ownership connections, the pattern was unmistakable. 11 of the 17 properties had been residential structures in mid-sized Midwestern cities. 3 were currently listed as vacant. One was under active municipal review for code violations unrelated to the federal investigation. 2 had been sold, their transfer records now being reviewed for whether the buyers were independent third parties or connected entities. The forensic team had flagged 4 additional property addresses for field investigation referral. The referrals were in the pipeline as of early July. Whether those addresses were active, vacant, or something else entirely was not yet known. The system that produced 2 plea agreements and closed this case in January had prioritized speed over scope. Plea agreements are efficient. They produce sentences without trials, free up court resources, and put defendants in custody. But they also close the file. When the file closes, the unindicted third party, the one whose name isn't in any charging document, keeps working. That is what happened here. The efficiency of the resolution created the conditions for the continuation of the operation. The 20 adults recovered from the Benson duplex were each accompanied to a private waiting area at Nebraska Medical Center by a victim services coordinator. Each had family notified. The calls went out between 5 and 7 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in April. Parents in Lincoln, a sister in Sioux City, a fiancé in Cedar Rapids, who had not slept a full night since October. One adult, a 24-year-old from Grand Island, had been reported missing on October 9, 2025. She had been missing for 172 days. The records that exist in the public domain give almost nothing of who these people were before their disappearances. What is preserved in the federal case file is bureaucratic. Names, dates of birth, case numbers from the missing persons reports filed in their home jurisdictions, the names of the law enforcement agencies that had fielded those reports. The missing persons files themselves are sealed. The victim services records are sealed. What the federal documentation allows is this: 20 adults, between 22 and 26 years old, reported missing from communities in Nebraska and Iowa across a span of roughly 5 months between late summer and late autumn of 2025. Each report had been taken seriously by local agencies. Each had been entered into the National Missing Persons Database. Each had generated follow-up activity at the local and state level that had not, before the Benson raid, connected to any active federal investigation. In the days after the raid, the victim services coordinators assigned to each person prepared intake assessments that were filed under seal. Those assessments asked standard questions about the circumstances of each person's disappearance, about the conditions of confinement, about medical and psychological needs. The answers to those questions are not part of the public record and will not be part of this account. What is part of the public record is the fact that federal prosecutors cited those sealed assessments in the superseding indictment as the evidentiary basis for the most serious charges filed against the third defendant. The charges carried mandatory minimum sentences that the U.S. Attorney's Office publicly described as reflecting the full severity of what had occurred inside that basement. The details of who each person was before disappearance, what she was doing, who was waiting, what the families had done across those months of silence, are not part of the federal documentation. They are private. The victim services files are sealed. What is in the record is the phone call documentation from the notification process. 20 families contacted, 20 confirmations of identity completed, 20 releases of basic status information, alive, in medical care, receiving attention, transmitted to next of kin, before the morning news cycle carried the first reports of the raid. They walked out of the Nebraska Medical Center's secure discharge bay under blankets, into vehicles, toward people who had not stopped looking. The federal documentation doesn't describe those reunions. It records the discharge times, the names of the escorting agents, the vehicle plate numbers, the destination addresses. Bureaucratic. Precise. Cold. That is the only register in which this story permits itself to be told. And in that restraint, in what the paperwork refuses to describe, is where the full weight of what happened lives. Here is where the case stood as of early July 2026. The third defendant remained in pretrial detention. No trial date had been set. The Delaware Registered Management Company had not been charged, and its principals, whoever they were, had not been publicly identified. The corporate structure was under active financial investigation, but that process, by its nature, is slow and does not generate press releases. The panel van recovered at the gas station on 49th Street had been processed by the FBI's evidence response team. Inside, packaging materials, a prepaid cell phone with a destroyed SIM, and a ledger, handwritten, spiral-bound, using the same numeric location coding system found in the original Pruitt-Hodge case materials. Whether that system pointed to additional properties in other cities was something the Financial Crimes Unit and the Innocence Lost Task Force were actively working. The Bureau had not said publicly how many locations might be connected. The task force coordinator, in a statement released through the U.S. Attorney's Office, described the investigation as ongoing and expanding. That is federal language for, "We don't know yet how big this is." Rachel Voss, the paralegal whose memo started all of this, was not mentioned in any press release. She returned to her desk the morning after the raid was reported in the news and continued indexing exhibits for an unrelated case. Her supervisor had sent her an email. It said, "Good catch." She filed it. Then she went back to work. The network is dismantled. The ledger in the panel van lists 12 location codes. 7 of them have been matched to known addresses. 5 have not. The investigation is ongoing. Comment yes if you think that ledger points to operations outside Nebraska, because the task force coordinators we've reviewed documentation from clearly believe